Russian Middle Ages as a time of the government control, of course at the same technical level, or as Dostoevsky wrote about the Inquisition's control, that we know better, we have the right version, we must force them to enjoy religion or good level of life, control them. In this sense, I see a so-called, let's call medieval threat. My question is, do you see any intellectual, political, or social movement trend which is against this and enforcing some kind of liberty, as you talk about liberty in Islam? Thank you.
I mean, I see all sorts of trends. The libertarian movement in the West is very anti-government, and they are very much against the power of the American government, and it's encroaching everywhere. For example, and the threats to liberty, human liberty, can come from many sources. It can come from authoritarian governments. It can come from the community. It can come from a society. It can come even a patriarchal father in a family, and the type of authoritarianism also changed in medieval era. And our medieval era is different from the European medieval era, by the way. We didn't have the Inquisition, and all the Dark Ages of Europe was not the case in the middle in our part of the world. But generally, there were less. The idea of democracy was not very powerful in medieval era. It was non-existent in most societies. So you only would hope that the ruler would be just and compassionate and tolerant. And Islamic, actually, medieval political theory is only about the justness of the ruler. There's no idea of re-electing the ruler or making him come to the ballots every 4 years, which would be impossible to organize in such a society where you had no communications. How would you campaign for an election? Nobody could read and write. So the democracy evolved as literacy, transportation, communication, the media. In the medieval era, there was no media, so nobody knew the acts of the government. Today, we open the newspaper and we see the finance minister said this. Nobody did this 500 years ago. The media came with printing technology and so forth and so forth. So, do I see movements? Yes, I see movements criticizing this particularly modern threat, maybe even postmodern threat. Some of them are anarchists. I mean, the guy who released WikiLeaks is an anarchist in the sense that he thinks the American government is a tyrannical government and he exposes all the secrets. It's fun to read. I'm glad that he did this. I mean, maybe it's illegal for American law. So, yes, there are libertarian or anarchist movements right now which challenge the power, the concentrated power of central governments, especially Western governments in a sense. How will this unfold? Well, that's a big question. I don't know. But that's an interesting perspective to bring in. Thank you. Oh, sorry, the Mufti and the Sultan. Yeah. Well, I'm not very knowledgeable on the system in Malaysia. So there's a Mufti of every state, and then the Sultan of every state is checked by the Mufti. Is that the case?
He's advised by the Mufti. He's the highest legal person that could endorse a religious law.
Well, that is a bit similar to the Ottoman system. In the Ottoman Empire, there was the Sultan and there was the Sheikh-ul-Islam, the top religious authority in Islam, and the Sultan had to get the blessing of Sheikh-ul-Islam to make a decision. The Sheikh-ul-Islam would check whether if it is Islamically acceptable or not. There are a few cases where sultans were tried and punished by the Sheikh-ul-Islam for violating the Sharia. Fatih Sultan Mehmet was fined by a mufti for unjustly punishing an architect of a mosque. The architect built the mosque, but the sultan didn't like it. He punished it, and then severely. And he went to the mufti, and mufti punished the sultan for punishing the man unjustly, gave him a fine, and the sultan. So actually, there is an idea of a supremacy of law there, which is important, because in pure totalitarian systems, the ruler is not checked by anything. Here in our tradition, we have the idea of an Islamic legal expert checking the executive. Of course, it's very dangerous if it becomes the mouthpiece of the executive and gives every decision that the sultan needs. And I don't know how it works, in different parts of the world. Well, you can say that as a person, you're not accepting the decisions of that mufti yourself. Maybe you're not a Muslim at all. Maybe you're, and that is where it gets tricky, because that mufti can be binding for the sultan, but if you're not that depends on the, of course, nature of the government. And I think the dichotomy in Malaysia is that it's a country governed at least partly by Islamic law, right? But not everybody's Muslim. And that's why I actually argue that making Islamic law the law of the land is problematic in itself, because Islamic law is supposed to be applicable only to Muslims. In the Ottoman Empire, before in the Dhimmi era, Muslims had their own legal system, but Jews and Christians had their own legal system as well. It was not universal. When the Ottomans made it universal, they made it by modernizing it and moving away from some classical notions of Islamic law, like abolishing the Dhimmi. Now, if you make Islamic law applicable to everybody, but don't reform it at all and keep it in the old fashion, you'll have a lot of trouble. Maybe that's some of the troubles here, but I don't want to comment on details. It's still a good thing that the mufti is there at least to check the excesses of the government and not is the mouthpiece of the government.
I've just been informed that Yang Berhormat Datuk Haji Malik bin Abdul Kasim, our State Exco for Religious Affairs, is here. Thank you for joining us today, Datuk. Is there any other questions from the floor? Maybe I would, before you could just summarize, I'd also just like maybe to ask your comment and also to share a little bit experience in the Malaysian context. The Malays, which are predominantly the Muslims in Malaysia, is an ethnic group that was basically defined where forced assimilation of multiple ethnic groups came about. And the main glue that keeps them together is the identity of Islam. So any kind of alternative view put forth in today's context, an alternative view put forth, or any kind of challenge to an existing mold that is there, is not only seen as questioning Islam, but probably also an attack on its identity. So it's also a nationalism issue here. So this makes it a bit difficult, even if you have different streams coming in that are, will start be labeled or grouped. They're liberal Islams, or they're progressives, or they're heretics, and so forth, and making the whole discourse, even among the community itself, very difficult. And sometimes to a point where maybe some just opt out of the discourse because it just becomes a bit problematic. How would you see that coming from, from a Turkish experience on nationalism there? Thanks.
Well, why Shafism is the dominant madhab, the sect in Malaysia? Probably the early Muslims who came here happened to be Shafis, right? Right? No? Mixed before, okay. Okay. Well, defining national identity strictly on a certain religious, linguistic basis is very problematic. In Turkey, we have an issue with our national identity too. Ottoman Empire was very multicultural and multi-religious. You would be an Ottoman, Muslim, Albanian, Arab, Kurd, Turk, Jew, anything. It was like being an American, Ottoman/Armenian, Ottoman Jewish. It was an empire. In that sense, it was pluralistic. When we moved to the Turkish Republic, everybody had to be Turkish this time. But not everybody was Turkish. Some were Kurdish, some were Laz, Circassian, Arab, Bosnian, and so on and so forth. Many of those non-Turkish groups assimilated into the larger mass, but Kurds remained as Kurds. And we had a lot of tension in Turkey between Kurdish nationalists and Turkish nationalists. Today, we are saying, in order to be able to win the Kurds, let's not define citizenship on Turkishness, but on Turkianness. Like, Not Turkish, but of Turkey or from Turkey. Türk or Türkiyeli. There are two expressions. So that the Kurds will feel that they are welcome. Some people think this is diluting the national identity. Others thinking making it more encompassing and welcoming. I am generally of the latter sort. Because let's not forget, nations are not equal to religious communities. If Islam has a nation, it's the Ummah. It goes from Morocco to wherever, Philippines, and with Muslim communities in all corners of the world, from a mosque in Germany to whatever. That's the Islam fold. Then there are nation states, Malaysia, Indonesia, Turkey, Egypt, this and that. These are nation states. These are geographical entities based on culture, food, language, certain ways of living, and so on and so forth. So it would be, I think, mistaken to define national identity merely with religious identity. Then you start to strip religion off from its real meaning, which is about your connection with the divine. And you turn this into, for example, the headscarf. Hijab, I think, is very valuable if it is, all sorts of it is valuable, but it is more meaningful from an Islamic perspective. If it is worn because you think that God told in the Surah Al-Nur of the Quran, the Muslim woman should cover their beauties and the cloth should be put above their head, like a certain clothing, as a religious injunction, like you fast. That's a very religious meaning. But if you put it to say, I'm not saying you, but it'd say, hey, I'm a Malay Muslim and I'm making the statement. Then it becomes something different. I think the first one is the Islamic ideal. The other one is a statement. Okay, everybody can have fashion statements too, but it's not that religious anymore. My feeling is that there are different understandings of nations and nation states. In France, it's a very homogenistic idea. You have to speak very well French. You have to eat like the French. You have to be Catholic or post-Catholic or atheist, but still something around that. And if you're a Muslim, if you eat halal, they think this conflicts with national identity. It's a very strict national identity, which creates a lot of trouble. In England, it's more diverse. You could be a British and you could be a Sikh wearing your turban. In America, you can be American Italian, American Jewish, American this, American. The loose it is, the better actually it is. Because it's more encompassing, it welcomes the citizens. The more tight you make it, actually you will certainly exclude some groups. Then you will have problems of internal struggles in society, some tensions, and so on and so forth. In Turkey, the struggle between the Kurds and the national government ultimately turned into a violent conflict. Thank God it's not happening here, as I understand. But for the well-being of society, I think it's better to have more inclusive national identities rather than putting very clear boundaries. Because identity is very personal. What percentage of you is Muslim and Malay and this and that? I mean, who knows? We are a combination of all these different identities. So it's better for the government not to define things too much. So let the people define themselves and be more comfortable in a more loose definition of identity. I don't know if it...
Okay, since there's no more questions, would you like to say anything just to sum up? Oh, that was your summary. Would you like to say anything else to just sum up your part? Or was that your summary?
Sure. Well, I love Malaysia. Penang is the best. And so far, among what I've seen. I mean, well, more is in my book, and it's worth buying. You know, I just gave you a little thing. It's just the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg. I think, when you look, we humans are motivated by similar desires. When people are authoritarian, they generally have a fear to be authoritarian, and that fear is common. They fear losing their identity, who they are. And honest dialogue, open dialogue is very important. In Turkey, Kurds and Turks, they didn't talk for centuries. We were not talking about it. Not talk about that issue. That's a dangerous issue, and it wouldn't be solved. Sit down and talk. What's your deal? Are you a separatist, a terrorist? No, he just wants to speak his language. And why are you afraid of the language? communication between, sometimes we live in bubbles. Although we live in the same city, same country, we actually don't know the other side. We have never been to their circles. We have never eaten in their homes. We have never stepped in their cultural zone. We have never sit down and discussed. That's why having media, having institutions like this, having personal conversation with the other, shows you that, actually, they were not that evil. They were not that bad. We just thought that they were. But when you think, you would understand the other person. Liberty is the medium which would allow us to do that. When you don't have liberty, you can't discuss. So someone will be angry. Someone will put us, will come and report. There will be an agent and this and that. Liberty is not a solution. Liberty is a basis in which we can find solutions to our problems. And if you ask me, it's the medium to be a good believer, because if you don't have the freedom, you can't be a good believer as well, because it only begins with your own personal conviction and persuasion and your willingness. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Okay, that comes to the end of the session. Thank you all for also listening. So now I would like to pass back to our MC today, Ms. Kanchana.
Thank you, Altaf and Mr. Mustafa. And thank you also to everyone for all the interesting comments and questions posed. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Mustafa's Akyol's book, Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty, is now available for sale in Penang. Orders for the book can be placed through Penang Institute, and the book is priced at Rm 50 ringgit each. We have now come to the end of the event. We hope that you've gained much insight from this talk. And we also hope to see you at the next event organized by Penang Institute. Have a pleasant day ahead. Thank you.
I was so happy to meet you and get your